Thousands of Syrians continue to live in the most dire of situations. Many of these children were born here. This is all they know about the world. And whilst these international conferences continue to take place, their lives haven't improved. In fact, they just keep getting worse.
Makia Sawan is blind in one eye. A widowed mother of 2 girls, she's been living here for more than 3 years. She says that when she first arrived, she had thought it would only be a few months before she'd be able to return to her home in Damascus.
Aid from the UN has stopped. The children's situation here makes you cry. Their parents can't even afford to feed or clothe them. They're hungry. There are children here who aren't even 10 years old, and they're working to help their parents.
This war has raged on for more than half a decade, and still there is no end in sight. The international community has only managed to show resolve when it's come to forming military coalitions. Without the same resolve being demonstrated to bring about peace, these children may never see the world beyond the miserable and squalid camps of Lebanon. Jamal Al-Shayal, Al Jazeera, the Bekaa Valley, Lebanon.
Well, joining us live now from Amman in Jordan is Karl Schembri from the Norwegian Refugee Council. Thank you very much for speaking to us. We were getting a snapshot there of life for some Syrian refugees in Lebanon. Tell me, what are your thoughts on the outcome of the conference with Ban Ki-moon today?
Well, what we're witnessing is a tidal wave of disappointment, really, from Europe and the wealthier nations that could be doing so much more to help this region with coping with a 5-year-old catastrophe now on its doorstep. It's extremely disappointing to see the lack of commitment. What we're asking for as Norwegian Refugee Council and the rest of the leading humanitarian agencies working in Syria is for these nations to wealthier nations in a much better position to shoulder responsibility for this tragedy, to take 10%, just 10% of around 4.8 million refugees living in just Jordan, Lebanon and Turkey. 10% of those, they are considered the most vulnerable, the ones who need the most help right now, because they are living in desperate conditions, just as your correspondent has just shown us. These people are not able to work in these countries. They're living in abject poverty, and they could be helped, and especially to stop this lethal journey that has been going on from this region to Europe. These people shouldn't be forced to take that journey. They should have an alternative route, as is their right as refugees. They should be given all the protection necessary. And yet again, we are being let down by Europe, by the rest of the wealthier countries that could be doing so much more.
Legal routes are not open to the millions of refugees outside of Syria in neighboring countries. And I suppose now there is a realization descending on many of these people in Lebanon, in Jordan, in Turkey, that what they thought might have been a temporary situation is becoming more permanent. What are the scenarios? What do you envisage happening over the next few years? Should the war in Syria continue, and should wealthier countries continue to refuse to resettle the most vulnerable?
Well, the reality is, Mariam, that in a year from now, we will probably be here again talking about resettlement of refugees. The only way to nip this in the bud, and for even selfishly for these countries who are now more obsessed with building borders and building walls and stopping refugees from reaching their shores, is for them to sit around the negotiating table. There is no military or not even a humanitarian solution to the crisis that is ongoing in Syria. There is only a political negotiated peace that can solve this crisis. Otherwise, we're going to be stuck in this patchwork of how many we resettle, how much aid is needed, which is never enough. We're struggling just to keep up with the sheer multitudes who need aid here. And the only viable solution is a peaceful, politically negotiated solution. And right now, we're at this very fragile moment of hope, where there is a very fragile cessation of violence, of hostilities inside Syria. But this won't last until it is followed up by a robust political process. And until we see that, we are bound to keep seeing the same scenario repeating itself, thousands of people fleeing, millions displaced internally inside Syria, and many more trying to cross into Europe in a potentially very lethal, very dangerous journey.
Well, thank you very much, Karl Schembri from the Norwegian Refugee Council, for sharing your thoughts with us today. Well, there is more to come for you on the News Hour. Turkey's security forces warn of a possible attack against non-Muslim sites.